Hello, Buckeye fans. It's Patrick Murphy here with a second episode of the Bucknuts Happy Hour this week. That's not something I think we've ever done in the history of this show. But Dave and I earlier on Wednesday did a episode where we talked mostly about the hiring of Matt Patricia for the Buckeyes defensive coordinator position. You can find that wherever you're watching this episode. And then I had some people asking me about my opinion on the hire, some of the other coaching hires. And I was like, well, I just did a whole, almost an hour-long podcast with Dave Biddle about this. And one of my, somebody pointed out to me, well, you didn't talk a lot about what you thought about it. It was a lot of Dave. You gave some thoughts. So I was like, well, maybe I'll do an extra episode this week if we have time. Wasn't sure if I would. Lo and behold, here we are. So first, got a Pabst Blue Ribbon. Really cold. So we're going to take this one a little slower so I don't give myself brain freeze here while we talk about the Buckeyes' new staff. Cheers. If you have questions, comments, feel free to throw those in the chat if you're watching this live, and I'll try and get to some of those if they show up. But I think it's an interesting group. And I wrote about this on Bucknuts on Thursday. You can read that story if you're a Bucknuts subscriber, sort of some of the ins and outs, but I'll touch on a lot of my thoughts on it. There was some other stuff in there, but it looks like this staff is complete. It looks like Buckeyes have their 2025 coaches in place. The one exception, I think, would be if Larry Johnson does decide to retire, move on, whatever the case may be. I don't know. I don't have a good sense of that. I know that Larry Johnson and Ryan Day met to talk about the future and what this Buckeye defense will look like. I think from my understanding, the ball is kind of now in Larry Johnson's court on what he wants to do. And then if he stays, obviously the Buckeyes have their defensive line coach. If he leaves, there will obviously be another search for a new staff member this offseason. But we'll address that more when we come to it. We will talk about Larry Johnson some in this, but I think we'll start with Matt Patricia because that does seem to be the most polarizing topic here. And if you listened on Wednesday when Dave and I were doing it, cheers. All right, cold, but not that cold for the beer. If you listened when Dave and I talked, Dave much more optimistic about this hiring than I was, at least initially. I'd say I've heard some more positive things about Matt Patricia, so maybe I've scaled it back a little bit, but I'm still a bit skeptical about this. Not that I don't think it will work, because I think it certainly can, and I don't want to come across as like this is a bad hire. But as I pointed out in the piece that I wrote on Bucknuts the other day, the idea of we're Ohio State, we can get the best, which is kind of what Ryan Day, I'm paraphrasing, but what Ryan Day said to Joel Klatt, he said it a couple times, I think. Is Matt Patricia the best option out there? And I don't have a great answer for that. And here's why. If you've followed along, you probably have seen all the stats about the Patriots defense and what they were able to do with Matt Patricia calling the plays, which predates him even going to the defensive coordinator role. Then he goes to Detroit as a head coach. That's not really relevant for what we're talking about, but what is maybe relevant is kind of the reports that came out afterwards of how he treated players and things like that, and just his general demeanor. That can change. I think it's important to point out, guy can learn from something like that. But in terms of his coaching, I'm not sure that has a huge impact. It was not a good Detroit Lions team at the time, and he was head coach, not the defensive coordinator, though involved with the defense, obviously. And then he has the brief stint with the Philadelphia Eagles, was there as, I think, like an analyst, or I don't know what his official title was. And then I believe it was the final 3 games of the season. If you remember, this was not the Eagles Super Bowl team. This was 2023. The defense was not good. Matt Patricia was asked to call the defense for, I think, the last 3 games of the regular season and then a playoff wildcard loss. It did not go well. But I think to Matt Patricia's credit, you're dealing with a group that you didn't really help put together. You're not the inner circle of the coaching staff, so to speak, though I'm sure he had some input. You're taking over a defense that was already playing poorly at that point in time, or not playing as well as I think people thought it would, coming off of the Super Bowl appearance a few years ago. And so that's a difficult situation to get thrown into. Not an impossible one, but a difficult one. And then I know there's been a lot of talk about Matt Patricia not being employed last year, and I'll get to that. So the first thing is for me, and this is where I just don't know, and I'm going to be honest, like I can't just fabricate something here. Like, how much of the Patriots defense was Matt Patricia? How much was Bill Belichick? Obviously, there's a balance there. There was an SI article that I think's been going around on social media about when Matt Patricia first got to the Patriots and kind of his whole hiring process. And I thought it was actually pretty interesting just about the thinking of Matt Patricia in the Patriots building. And it, at least from this article, it sounds like from the people quoted and some of the other stuff, like he was really well thought of. So yes, he was running Bill Belichick's defense, but it does sound like it was very involved with this. And at the very least, you're working with Bill Belichick. Things rub off. And it sounds like this is a guy who went to a really good school, was an engineer, I believe, before he became involved in the football stuff. And, really smart, really detailed guy. Yeah, he went to, I'm probably going to mess this up, Rensselaer Polytechnical Institute. He did play guard there, and initially was not working in football. And details, data, those type of things seem to be where Matt Patricia kind of got his start with the Patriots and really quickly worked his way up into a full-time coaching role and whatnot. So I think that part of it is impressive and stuff that he can bring to Ohio State. But in terms of just the actual ability to coach defense, I don't know how much was Bill Belichick. And I don't know, having not been there, how much what was Matt Patricia. And that's what I think we're going to learn here over these next several months, especially once the season starts, is what is Matt Patricia as a coach of defense on his own? Because he's never really done that without Bill Belichick's shadow over him. And at Ohio State, you don't have anyone over you in that role. You have Ryan Day, but he is obviously much more on the offensive side. And now you kind of get the chance for the first time to run your defense or run a defense. Obviously, he had a lot of say in what they did defensively in Detroit. Cheers. But if you are the head coach, you obviously have a lot more going on than just the defense, which, to Matt Patricia's credit, was why he was the defensive coordinator in New England. And, Bill Belichick, as heavily involved as he may have been defensively, you do have to rely on someone else. So my concern is that outside of those Patriots teams, Matt Patricia has not had a great track record. And again, head coach, different than defensive coordinator, analyst thrust into play calling duties late in the season, or whatever his title was, not the same as being a head coach, or being a defensive coordinator, excuse me. But it's still just not, it's not the track record I think most people would have expected. And that's what the other thing. If you were expecting Ryan Day to go out and hire the best defensive coordinator available, did he do that? I don't know. And I would have liked to have been able to sit here like I did a few years ago when he hires Jim Knowles. And after I really looked into Jim Knowles, it was like, damn, that is a guy who is arguably one of the best defensive coordinators in the country, as opposed to a guy who you have questions about, right? And I think even if you are excited about this hire, trusting in Ryan Day, which I am, I want to make that very clear. I think Ryan Day deserves the benefit of the doubt, with a few exceptions. I think Ryan Day's hires have been really good, and obviously recently have been really good. So I think that you would have just liked to have been able to been like, yeah, that looks like a home run hire. And that's what they did with Jim Knowles 3 years ago. And this is not that same situation. There are guys out there that could have gone, and I'm not going to get into a list of defensive coordinators, but there are plenty of guys that would have been very interested in this Ohio State job in the NFL, maybe, but definitely in college. And you look at some of the defensive coordinator movement across the country already this offseason, I think you see some of that. Like Clemson just went out and hired Tom Allen from the same position at Penn State. And, those are two playoff teams. Obviously, Penn State made it further. I think Penn State right now is in a better situation, but Tom Allen made that move. Ohio State could have done something similar and gone and got somebody who is considered one of the best defensive coordinators in college. Instead, they went for a guy who wasn't employed, but does have the Patriots track record. And there's a couple reasons maybe why Ryan Day did this. And we haven't talked to Coach Day about this. I know he made some comments to local news about some of the staff, but I don't believe Matt Patricia was addressed in that. If I'm wrong, I've just missed that. Cheers. I think that Ryan Day, my initial understanding was that they wanted to keep as much continuity as possible, even while losing Jim Knowles. You've got 8 starters walking out the door. So you're bringing in a bunch of new guys. Let's try and keep it, make this transition to a new defense as seamless as possible. And I mean, new defense in terms of personnel. And that's why I thought from people I'd talked to and just kind of what I'd been hearing that, they would promote Matt Guerrieri and Tim Walton at one point. That seemed to me to be the favorite in terms of the job. There was obviously talk about guys like Joe Cullen, Randy Bates, though I think people have since sort of not refuted that, but just it sounds like maybe that was more an agent putting his name in. But the Joe Cullen stuff was something I heard quite a bit about. I don't know what happened there. But so obviously Ryan Day looked at the NFL and liked what he saw. He's done this before, and you do wonder, I don't know, is there a prior relationship between him and Matt Patricia? Ryan Day obviously grew up a New England Patriots fan. He was working in Boston College at the same time as Matt Patricia was working on the Patriots staff. I don't know if the two have any prior relationship, but that would help explain it a little bit. You'd think coaches living in the same city would maybe run into each other every once in a while, especially younger coaches at that point in their careers. So I think that Ryan Day at some point pivoted from, at least from what I understand, is like more of the continuity to maybe wanting more of a head coach of the defense like Jim Knowles was. And I think that may have had to do with the decisions on the offensive side of the ball, which we'll get to here in a few minutes, and going with sort of a younger group there. And maybe Ryan Day recognizes, hey, I might need to be more involved than a year ago when I had Chip Kelly on that side of the ball. He's still trying to be that CEO role, but just, hey, I maybe want to keep an eye on some things over here. And then now I have a guy in Matt Patricia who can work with Tim Walton and the rest of the staff. And he has run a defense before. He's called plays. He's been a head coach. And so I think that makes sense if that is indeed the approach by Ryan Day. It's just a matter of the pieces coming together. And I should say, I meant to say this off the top. I know there is, and I've seen it brought up quite a bit. Well, not quite a bit. I've seen it brought up some. The stuff with Matt Patricia and sexual assault charge when he was 21 or 22 or something along those lines. When Dave and I did the show the other day, honestly, I didn't even think about this. I remember when he was getting the Lions job that this came up as a thing, and I didn't really remember what it was. But I do think that that's something that will have to be addressed. Obviously, he's had multiple jobs in coaching since then. The situation, you can read about it. I don't want to go too far down, but that's certainly something Ryan Day, Ross Bjork will have to address at some point. And Matt Patricia probably himself when he meets with the media. But I didn't want to completely ignore that. And I meant to mention that off the top. And then I saw a comment here that from Golfer, we could argue Chip Kelly was on a career downturn when he came here. I think this guy's the same. He'll do well for a year or two in the NFL, and will do well for a year or two in the NFL. We'll start knocking on the door for coordinator. I think that's a valid point about Chip Kelly and something I wanted to bring up as well. While I think if you're Ohio State coming off a national championship, you could have gone out and hired almost any defensive coordinator in the country. Yes, the Chip Kelly thing is a similar example. Now, the difference is Ryan Day and him have this long history together that, again, I don't know the relationship between Matt Patricia and Ryan Day. I think also while Chip Kelly did not work out as a head coach at UCLA, maybe the similarities with the Lions there. I think most people who looked at Chip Kelly still saw an innovative offensive mind that wasn't maybe able to execute it as high of a level at UCLA because you didn't have the personnel that you had at a place like Oregon when he was there or Ohio State. So, yeah, I think there are some similarities, and I think that's fair to point out. Obviously, that was a success. Chip Kelly goes on to the NFL, and we'll see what happens there. M. Smith asked, will we be here again in 2 to 3 years? You may be there next year. I don't know. I don't want to make any assumptions about what Matt Patricia is doing here, but this definitely could be a situation of go to Ohio State for a year, work with very talented people in that program, build my reputation back up, and, hopefully get an idea or get a path back to the NFL or whatever situation he wants to be in. So I think that could be something next season, off season. We're talking about a new defensive coordinator. Maybe at that point, you've got a guy like Tim Walton, Matt Guerrieri, who both got promotions. And I think well-deserved promotions. Again, if you have questions about this, feel free to throw them in the chat here if you're watching this live. But those two, I think, are really good. I was going to say young coaches. Matt Guerrieri, young coach. Tim Walton, not so much so. And I think it makes a lot of sense to give these guys recognition, not just Ryan Day talking about them at the national championship celebration, but doing it by giving them these titles. Tim Walton is co-defensive coordinator. Matt Guerrieri is pass game coordinator, pass game coach. I don't know what exactly they will call it. But I think they earned them. Tim Walton in his 3 years at Ohio State, I mean, look at the play of the secondary. And last year he was the secondary coach working with Matt Guerrieri. But certainly well-deserved with the way that these guys have developed. Tim Walton has become arguably Ohio State's second best recruiter after Brian Hartline, who we'll get to in a little bit. I think that, Matt Guerrieri, obviously only 1 year, but you look at what he's done already in a short period of time, a defensive coordinator at Duke, a defensive coordinator at Indiana. I think he was co-defensive coordinator both times. Cheers. But, these are two guys who have worked really hard and have accomplished a lot. Tim Walton, both the NFL level and at Ohio State, and Matt Guerrieri at a few different places. And then now, what he brings to Ohio State, an Ohio guy. Tim Walton, the guy who played at Ohio State. Not that necessarily matters, but I think there is something to that. And so I think it makes sense for Ryan Day to do this. And I also think that you're looking at the setup of the defense, and let's assume Matt Patricia, that as a defensive coordinator, works well. But you also you have this setup of Tim Walton and Matt Guerrieri can still run the back end as they did last year. You've got James Laurinaitis and, assuming he comes back, Larry Johnson or whoever is the defensive line coach doing that. And then Matt Patricia is more of a front end guy as well. So now you have the defensive coordinator and the co-defensive coordinator kind of potentially divvying up responsibilities there. And we saw how well Matt Guerrieri and Tim Walton worked together this past season. I don't think you wanted to break that up or risk breaking that up. Whether Matt Guerrieri was going to go somewhere, I know there were interests from places for his services. And so I think, figuring out a way to make sure he stays happy and I don't think McElroy wasn't happy, but just, when there are opportunities for potential advancement, these guys are ambitious. You have to work with them in that way. And I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think now with the way this is setting up, those two, along with Larry Johnson, James Laurinaitis, are familiar with the defense that Ohio State has played. I don't know if it will look exactly the same next season. In fact, I doubt it. I think it was, even if Jim Knowles had stayed, I think it was going to change just given your personnel. It's going to look different. I think one of the advantages of Matt Patricia is he's a guy who has proven he can work in different schemes and with different personnel. He's talked about, hey, when we got this guy, I think Patrick Chung was the guy that he used as an example. Like, when we got this guy, we could do some different things in coverage, so we changed some things. Sometimes it's been an odd front, 3-down lineman. Sometimes it hasn't been under him. So I think he will be able to take the personnel, work within what Ohio State's framework of a defense is, along with these other coaches, and create a good defense. This is all assuming that it works out as him as a defensive coordinator without Bill Belichick over the top. Trying to be positive since I was sort of negative about it earlier. I think if there is another change on the defensive line position with Larry Johnson, I imagine Ryan Day will work quickly to bring somebody in who can work within that framework. I would be surprised. I saw somebody earlier mention, I don't know where the comment went, so I apologize. But Alan Clark, who was Larry Johnson's assistant, left to be the defensive ends coach at Texas. Even if Larry Johnson stays, I imagine Ryan Day looks to fill that spot with someone similar, a guy who, can bring a lot to this, even if it is behind the scenes and, as a kind of an assistant to Larry Johnson. But there is the framework of something that could work there. And I've said this a couple times on things that I've been on. Let's be clear. This defense was not going to be the same in 2025 as 2024. You lose 8 starters, veteran guys who played multiple years. This defense, talent-wise, could still be one of the better defenses in the country. Maybe by the end of the year, it's the best defense in the country again. But I think that you have to accept that there's going to be some drop-off, potentially at least, from this group, even if all of the coaches had come back, right? I mean, you lose your entire defensive line, you lose your middle linebacker, you lose your top cornerback, and you lose a very good safety. Like, that's a lot of holes to fill. And now you're bringing in a new defensive coordinator. So, but again, I think the framework is there for this to work out well. It has to fit. And I want to see from Matt Patricia prove it to me, basically. And again, this is all under the cloud of trusting in Ryan Day, which I do. And I think, if this flames out and it looks really bad, then, maybe we question Ryan Day again about some of the coaching hires. But until that happens, given you're coming off a national championship, I think you have to respect what he's done. And we'll see. Consider me in the we'll see category on that side of the ball when it comes to coaching staff. Moving to the offensive side of the ball, I think what they've done is pretty interesting. Cheers. I want to make it clear. I think Brian Hartline, who is now your offensive coordinator again, co-offensive coordinator last year, and Keenan Bailey, who will now be co-offensive coordinator with Brian Hartline, have earned the right to get these promotions. I've said in the past that I don't think Ohio State is the place for you to be learning on the job as a coach. But you look at Ryan Day and did a pretty damn good job. Michigan games aside, I think that he is proof that can happen. It's the counterpoint to my argument. of, Ohio State. You should be hiring the best guys that have already proven it. So I understand Ryan Day is looking at his own success, looking at talented coaches on his staff and saying, why go find somebody else to do this job again when we have guys here that if I don't do it, I being Ryan Day, somebody else is going to hire Brian Hartline to be an offensive coordinator at some point. He's interviewed. Somebody else is going to hire Keenan Bailey away to go do, a bigger role than tight ends coach. And so I think Ryan Day looks at it and says, let's keep these guys in-house. Let's reward, like I was rewarded for my work as an offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach to being promoted head coach after Urban Meyer. Let's reward these guys. Let's keep our talent here. It's similar to, I said this on Wednesday with Biddle. It's similar to a year ago when Ohio State was focused on player retention, and you are now focused on coaching retention and keeping those coaches in-house. Is it the right way to do it? We're going to see. You look at 2023 with Brian Hartline as offensive coordinator. Cheers. I saw someone ask, it's Pabst Blue Ribbon today. It's hard to judge based on that because A, we're not in the meeting, so we don't see what Brian Hartline does every day to help get the offense ready. And B, he wasn't calling plays. Now he will be calling plays. But I also think if you are Ryan Day, you're around Brian Hartline every day, right? You're seeing him go through these things. You watched him kind of go through the mock games, the scrimmages, and call plays 2 years ago. I have to imagine he was involved heavily in that while he wasn't the guy in the booth calling the plays. They're all in the headset, things like that. So, again, you've got to trust in Ryan Day to have really assessed this situation, looked at other options at offensive coordinator. I would, even if they don't interview people or anything like that, you certainly know kind of what's out there. And you look at Brian Hartline and say, it's not even let's give this guy a chance, because I think he's, that sounds like you're just, let's let him try it. No, I don't think that's what it is at all. I think Brian Hartline has earned the right to get this opportunity. And while it will be his first time calling plays, I think Ryan Day is smart enough to recognize when a guy is ready for something along those lines. Just like 2 years ago, he recognized, yes, I want to promote Brian Hartline, but A, I'm not ready to give up play calling, and B, he's probably not ready to do it at the level that we need. Well, now you're 2 years on from that, and he's worked with not only Ryan Day and Chip Kelly, but Chip Kelly. And so I think you've got the makings of a young and exciting offensive coordinator that could be around for quite some time. Does Brian Hartline want to be a head coach at some point in time? I don't know that. If he does, maybe it's at some point when Ryan Day is no longer there. Maybe he leaves for a job at another school at some point. But you've kept one of your most important pieces on the offensive side of the ball, both from a schematic thing, because Brian Hartline heavily involved in the pass game planning and things like that. Ryan Day's talked about that. Plus, he's your best recruiter. And now he's not just going to be recruiting wide receivers. He will be helping in all aspects. And I think he's been doing that to some degree already. Certainly was a couple of years ago. So I think this makes sense. Keenan, a guy who a lot of people have a lot of respect for, has risen very quickly. Yes, he was a tight ends coach, but if you look at what he worked with when he was an assistant, he's worked with every position on the offensive side of the ball. And if you talk to Keenan Bailey about football, the guy knows his stuff. And I think that this is an opportunity for him to expand that role. And I think it's going to benefit the Buckeyes. He'll still be able to work with tight ends, from my understanding. But he'll be able to kind of influence more than just that tight end room, which I think makes a lot of sense. Now, the one question I do have is, as these guys add titles like co-offensive coordinator, how much time does he spend in the tight end room versus how much time does he spend outside of that and, working with the offense as a whole? I don't know. I don't know how time will be divvied up between all these different responsibilities. Brian Hartline, how much you've got these wide receivers too, you still got to work with, right? So how much time are you working with them? And also you've got Billy Fessler now, who's the quarterback's coach. While you did have Corey Dennis before as a quarterback's coach, we know how heavily Ryan Day was involved with the quarterbacks. We know Ryan Day wants to continue in this CEO role, though, as I said earlier, he may have to spend some more time working with the young offensive coaching staff. But, what does that look like without having an offensive coordinator who is also working with quarterbacks? We'll see. And then the other hire was or will be Tyler Bowen as offensive line coach, which is interesting because if you look at his resume, there's not a lot of offensive line coaching experience. Now, that does not mean he wasn't working with offensive line, but where he has some really interesting experience is working as an offensive coordinator. That's what he was doing at Virginia Tech the last, I think, 3 years. And so that's really interesting. You bring in, it's another situation where a guy, it at least appears to take kind of a step down in terms of the job title to come work at Ohio State. Chip Kelly a year ago. Cheers. And now you bring a guy with experience calling plays, experience running an offense to work there as an offensive line coach. A really good recruiter, though at Virginia Tech, he wasn't asked to do that a ton from my understanding. It was more, he was more like a Chip Kelly, like a Jim Knowles. And you now have another voice in the room that is, experienced in that aspect of offense. And I think it will only help Brian Hartline, Keenan Bailey, and these guys as titles and all that stuff. I think are important, but like these guys all collaborate, right? It's not just the offensive coordinators deciding the game plan each week and calling the play. There's a lot of collaboration that goes on in the build up to games, even during games, be on those headsets, things like that. So it's not one guy, and it has always been a collaboration, but I do think a guy like Tyler Bowen is interesting from that standpoint. Now, offensive line, I mentioned his recruiting. That's going to be key. That was the biggest knock on Justin Fry, right? Is he couldn't get those big time recruits to Ohio State. Tyler Bowen will have to prove he can do that. And certainly not easy. You're coming in now in an interesting time where you've got 3 top linemen in the 2026 class in the state of Ohio that you're going to have to do some catch up with. But now, what is Tyler Bowen as a developer? Because we did see, though it took some time, as should have been expected, we did see Justin Fry's ability to develop guys, especially this past year. And that's why he's now off to the NFL with the Arizona Cardinals, is because of the way he works with players. So what is Tyler Bowen in that sense? How does he bring guys along? The recruiting, there's the recruiting, but then the developmental part. And I think that that's going to be important because, as I said, he doesn't have a long track record of being just an offensive line coach. Now, again, that doesn't mean he wasn't also working with offensive line. I mean, you go back to Kevin Wilson, he was the co-offensive coordinator and tight ends coach at one point, and he was still working with offensive linemen. So that can be done, but it's going to be interesting to hear when we finally do get to talk to Ryan Day, how he kind of pictures this whole thing going, really on both sides of the ball, and then what will be the kind of fallout from here? What's next with this staff? And look, honestly, we'll make assessments as we go through spring and we see things. And then, but the real answers will come next fall, right? When we see it on the field. And, I think often with new hires and things like that, it's exciting and like, okay, but this is going to be great. And not that I'm trying to be negative about them necessarily, but I think you do have to look and just say, and this is kind of the conclusion that I made in that piece I mentioned earlier about the staff you can read on Bucknuts, is there were some risks taken here, right? Promoting Brian Hartline, promoting Keenan Bailey, a little bit of a risk. You don't know. It's not like you went out and hired two co-offensive coordinators, or however you want to frame it, as that had a proven track record at other programs. I understand, and as I explained earlier, the reasons why Ryan Day, I think, did that, but it is a little bit of a risk, right? If Brian Hartline, I don't think this will happen, but if Brian Hartline turns out to be a bad play caller, you're in a tough situation next season with a new quarterback and new running backs, two new tackles, and other all of this. There's a lot of newness coming in. Now you've got a new play caller. So if that doesn't work, you're in a tough spot. Defensively, same thing. You bring in a guy like Matt Patricia, who, as I said, I don't think was the best guy available necessarily, at least on paper. So I think that's a little bit of a risk too. But sometimes risks pay off, right? And I think Ryan Day has a chance to, in a year's time, look out and say, look at what we did again. And that doesn't necessarily mean the Buckeyes win the national championship, but hey, look, Matt Patricia came in and did a really good job. Hey, Brian Hartline proved he's a really good play caller. Look at what Keenan Bailey did. Look at what Tyler Bowen added to this. And look at this offensive line recruiting class we got. Like, obviously that's a best case scenario, but risks do pay off sometimes. And I think right now, as a national championship winning coach, Ryan Day has the ability to take those risks. Whereas maybe, if the Buckeyes, say, lost to Oregon in the Rose Bowl, maybe he doesn't have as much freedom to do some of these things. And he would probably push back and say he doesn't think these are risks. And I think that's fair. Obviously, he's vetted these guys. As I said, the guys that are being promoted, he's worked with plenty. But I think from an outside perspective, that's what it looks like. You didn't go hire the best defensive coordinator available out there. You didn't go hire the best offensive coordinator available. His comments about this is Ohio State and, kind of alluding to the fact that we can make these big hires. That's not the direction Ohio State went. That doesn't mean it was the wrong direction, though. And, I know I'm kind of talking out of both sides of my mouth here, but I also think that, to assess these hires or these promotions right now is tough to do. And, I think you've got to see it to really say one way or the other. And, I think when we get into the season next year and kind of see what this looks like, and again, this is going to be a really young team, so you may not be able to fairly assess this team until the second half of the season, but we saw what a team can do in the second half of the season this past year with the way the Buckeyes changed the defense and whatnot. I think that's when you can really start to say, was this the right hire? Was it the wrong hire? And even then, sometimes, look at Justin Fry. I think people were trying to run him out of town for quite some time, and then he's a huge part of why the Buckeyes won the national title. So sometimes it takes even longer, depending on what you're evaluating and things like that. So we sit here and we kind of judge, but also recognize that the real assessments come down the road. And I think that's the only fair way to do it, honestly. Cheers. All right. I said if you had questions, I would try and get to those. I think we've touched on a few of them. Tyler Kurtzley asked, why is everyone in the media so skeptical about Matt Patricia? Well, I think I highlighted that, at least from my perspective. I will say I don't think it's everyone. Talk to Dave Biddle. He's pretty excited. Other people who have been more upbeat about it. I know there are also people who are very negative about it. I think that is kind of my point, is like, we just don't know with Matt Patricia, because basically the only time he's ever been a defensive coordinator, he had the best defensive head coach also there, and we weren't in those meeting rooms, right? So, we can only assess certain certain things, numbers, analytics, like that stuff. And you can kind of spin that whatever way you want. You can say, I think it was 8 years New England had a top 10 defense on points per game, right? But you can also look at the DVOA and say, okay, it wasn't that good based on who they played and things like that. So you can use whatever numbers you want to make a point. That's why I'm kind of like, I don't think it's the best hire, but I'm willing to see. M. Smith asked, was he the only one interviewed? I assume you're talking about Matt Patricia there. I'm not sure. I know there were obviously conversations with people and things like that in terms of formal, fly to Columbus or whatever interviews. I honestly don't know if that's the case. Jermaine H. Runnels, why no spring game but spring workouts? I don't know if there's not going to be a spring game. Ohio State has just labeled it. What did they call it? Like a spring showcase, I think is what they did. I just assume that this will look different. That doesn't mean that there won't be something at the shoe that fans can come to and they do, game stuff. I think it was Jim Tressel, if I remember correctly, maybe even Jim Tressel's last spring. They did, I remember like them out there in like the camouflage stuff, the coaching staff. They did like basically a parts of practice, and it wasn't a real game. I don't remember exactly why that was the case then. Maybe it was a numbers issue or whatnot, but I assume based on the fact that they're going to have stuff at the shoe, Ohio State announced kind of the stuff that will go on along with what we would assume would be the spring game. There will still be something, whether it is actually two separate teams playing against each other. We've kind of lost that in recent years anyway. I think that you've seen guys switching team. It's not the spring game as it used to be. I think this is even probably going to be a little bit more pulled back from that, but I don't know. It's a good question, but I do still think there will be a spring game, and you kind of have to have spring workouts, right? I mean, you don't just go all off season without doing anything. Let's see if we have any more. If you have any other questions that you haven't put in the chat would like to be answered, throw those in. I'm going to scan through here real quick. Sorry, this is great podcasting. I thought I grabbed the ones that I saw pop up, but sometimes while I'm talking, it doesn't always. I don't always see them. M. Smith, will O-line recruiting get better in your opinion? I think so. Based on what I've been told about Tyler Bowen's reputation as a recruiter, I think that is probably a strength of his, I would say. Let's see. Some of these I've already answered, so I'm just going to skip. Let's. Here, Doug Lundell said, just can't get a grasp on a man being a professional coach for 25 years and folks with zero experience questioning his qualifications. That's fair. That's definitely fair. He's done it at a high level, he being Matt Patricia, for a long time. But I think we've explained why there's room for questioning and why there's room for optimism. Buck Rational said, PBR, D-Bids, get this guy a raise. I like light beer. I drink a lot of different beers. These are just easy to drink on this show, and I don't have to worry about, I still have the rest of my day to do. Still have some work to do. So I can't, I've had some other things, though. I've had an IPA on this show and things like that. And we had some people over for the Super Bowl, so we have some beer left over from that, and that's where this is. Also, Biddle has no impact on how much money I make. I don't know what people think of the hierarchy of Bucknuts, but he doesn't, if it were up to Dave, actually, I don't know what Dave would pay me if it were up to him. Let's see if there's anything else here. Lisa Sims. So when is Day going to do a press conference so we can talk to all the coaches about their new roles and our two new coaches? Maybe next week. Man, that is a good question. It will not be next week. We were already told they're not planning anything for next week. The following week is the NFL Combine. So a lot of people, myself and Steve Hellwagon included, will be in Indianapolis for that. So I doubt they do anything then. So I think we're looking at maybe right before spring practice, which I have voiced my opinion to those who make these decisions or at least coordinate these things. I think it would have been nice to get Coach Day sooner rather than later. We also used to get early enrollees and now transfer guys. We haven't done that. So I don't like this, but I can't force them to make that talk or make the players and coaches talk. And I know a lot of those guys just went through a lot with the national championship run. I would say the young guys and the incoming guys, not so much. Charles Parks, do we think the OC and DC will coach from the sideline? Matt has coached from the sidelines in the pros all the time. I could see Heartline doing that, but I know that won't be settled till near the first game. Yeah, so Matt Patricia, I like you said, I think if you've watched Patriots games, he was on the sideline, pencil in his ear. And Brian Hartline's obviously been on the sidelines for, I think, all of his coaching career here. I could be wrong about that, but what you could do is it depends how you want to break it down. And coaches obviously have different opinions on this. You could have on the offensive side, Brian Hartline still on the sideline, calling plays from there with Keenan Bailey up in the booth, kind of feeding information and things. And that's what I'm talking about it being a collaborative process. I would be surprised if Matt Patricia who has done that his whole career from the sidelines, would want to go up to the booth, but I don't know. That's certainly something we'll ask. We'll probably get told that'll be worked out, and we probably won't know for sure until late in fall camp, but I think it's a very good question and something we will need to find out. Buck Rational, any chance of you having guests on here in the future, Pat? Yes, for sure. There are a couple people that I would like to have on. There's some that I am waiting kind of more to the off season, like once everything quiets down, just some more like general Buckeye talk. We've done that with some people in the past, but I'd like to, Tim Hall's a guy I like to have on, Titus Powell, Devere Posey, those guys, when they are available, I like to get on. And there's some other people Buckeye wise that I think will be pretty interesting. Today was just kind of, like I said off the top, sort of impromptu in the fact that I wanted to kind of go through everything because we didn't really talk about this the other day. Jonathan Dickens asked, what promotion did Matt G and OG Walt get? So Walton is the co-defensive coordinator. Matt Guerreri is the pass game coordinator, I believe. And then Jermaine H. Reynolds, winter workouts going on. I'm interested in Quincy Porter versus Mylan Graham. Yes, I do believe that those have started. Maybe they push that back a little, but I think if they haven't started already, they will start. They will start very soon. Mat drills and conditioning, and the least fun part of the year, but maybe the most important, especially for a team like this with so many young guys coming back and stepping into bigger roles. All right, last one, also from Jermaine H. Reynolds. Buckeyes men basketball get in the dance. Yes, I do believe they will be in the dance. I wrote about that. It was before the Washington game. You can read it on Bucknuts that they're in a really good spot. I think most projections have them as like a 10 seed with an opportunity to move up. The game against Michigan on Sunday will be a big one at the shot. The Big Ten, they sit and I think tied for 8th or 9th. So yeah, you're in a good position. If you're Ohio State, they don't have any bad losses, which is the big thing. And, Washington was an opportunity to have a quad 3 loss. They beat the brakes off of Washington. So handling their business. Would have been nice to get that Nebraska game at Nebraska, but you have an opportunity against them. I think the second to last game of the season in Columbus. So I think they're in a good spot. Just don't piss down your leg, as they say. And Doug Shepard Sr. said, crowds need to show up Sunday and make some noise. Yeah, that would be nice. It's been pretty quiet at the shot this year, and understand why to some degree. All right, I'm going to wrap it up. I've got more stuff to do. This went longer than I expected. So thank you guys for tuning in. Also, I appreciate the questions. I always love when I can interact with you guys on here. So always bring questions. Some shows we don't have as much time to answer them as we do others, but I like to do that as much as possible when we have the opportunity. Again, thank you guys. We'll be back next week. I'm not sure exactly what we'll do, but expect, generally later in the week, look for a Bucknuts Happy Hour episode. And it won't be impromptu this week. Both of these were kind of out of left field a little bit in terms of schedule. This one will be more planned. Anyway, thank you, Buckeye fans. Yes, Doug, I was just going to say that. Hit that like button and subscribe. Subscribe to Bucknuts, all that good stuff. Appreciate you all. We'll talk soon. Cheers.